If you talk to any professional saxophonist today and ask him about the most influential players of all time on his instrument, you can be assured that the name Joe Henderson will come up among the top 5. In this lesson, we are going to explore several aspects of Joe Henderson's unique vocabulary from a group of over 30 phrases that I have transcribed. And we are specifically going to learn about his frequent use of motif development using rhythmic displacement. I am also going to show you tips on how to practice and recall these ideas during your solos. But before I teach you some Henderson phrases, I am going to improvise over the changes to Green Dolphin Street and adapt some of these concepts throughout the solo. And this will give you the bigger picture of how this kind of vocabulary fits in the context of a set of changes. And you will also see the word concept come up every time I use one. So during the lesson I can refer to it and show you the original Joe Henderson phrase that I adapted. You might have noted that the concepts I adapted are not your typical bebop sounding lines. You will learn that they are originally very short, and unlike a full-fledged bebop line, if played out of context, they don't always imply the changes. As a matter of fact, they might even sound silly. For example, take this lick. Doesn't sound like much, does it? It's all about context. I bring this up because I want you to know that these post-bop concepts are to be viewed as a new layer of ideas that you can add to an underlying bebop foundation. What I am trying to say is that post-bop did not replace bebop. It is not an isolated idiom. It is the natural evolution and extension of bebop, and thus still retains its foundation. So if you listen to Joe Henderson, you will note that these concepts we are going to examine are interspersed among some hardcore bebop lines. And here is proof. Listen first to this 2-5-1 line from Charlie Parker's solo on CC. Now listen to how Henderson adapts it on bars 46 and 47 of his solo on Recordame. Earlier I stated that Henderson employed motivic sequencing using rhythmic displacement. So what is rhythmic displacement? Let me play a 4-note motif. Notice that it consists of eighth notes. Now, if I assign eighth note triplets to each 4-note motif, the 4th note will begin on the 2nd beat and will displace the motif to begin again on the 2nd eighth note triplet of the 2nd beat. This is rhythmic displacement. It almost has a polyrhythmical quality to it. Listen to how it sounds. 1, 2, 3, 4. I actually use this concept towards the end of my solo. Now that we have a better understanding of using motifs with rhythmic displacement, let's examine the Joe Henderson phrases that I adapted to my solo. The very first measure was based on Joe Henderson's use of Lydian vocabulary over black narcissus. And this is in 3/4 time. If you analyze it, here he is superimposing the notes of a B minor pentatonic over a C major 7 sharp 11. Let's examine 2 more phrases by Henderson, and then we'll hear how I adapted them to the initial measures of my solo. This one is off Henderson's solo on Invitation off the album Tetragon. Notice how the 4-note motif starts on the end of one and thus always starts on the second half of each beat. This is rhythmic displacement again. This one is also from the same recording. Again, we have rhythmic displacement using a 4-note motif over 8th note triplets. And notice how it always begins on the second 8th note triplet of each beat. Now let's listen to the first 6 measures of my solo and listen to how I adapted these 3 concepts to the changes that I was playing over. Let's examine the next 2 phrases I adapted. This first one's also from Henderson's solo on Invitation. It's very simple, yet very interesting when you hear it in context. This next one is from Henderson's solo on I Have a Dream, from one of my all-time favorite albums, The Prisoner by Herbie Hancock. Again, a 4-note motif using rhythmic displacement by beginning the 16th note sequence in the middle of each beat. And remember that one because in brief you'll hear how I adapted it to a 2/5. This next one is also from Invitation, but interestingly enough, Henderson played the same line at the end of his solo on Firewater, also off The Prisoner, and it sounds like this. So next let's listen to measures 17 through 20 of my solo so you can hear how I adapted these 2 phrases to the changes I was playing over. I want to give you some important tips on how to practice and recall these concepts, and I also want to show you some more Joe Henderson phrases. But before I do, like I usually do with most of my lessons, I want you to know that I have prepared a special study package that you can download. And it features a PDF with regular notation and detailed tab of 31 phrases from Joe Henderson transcriptions. And I have organized the PDFs into 3 categories: motifs with rhythmic displacement, lines with motivic sequences, and a section on Joe's use of Lydian vocabulary. Included also are MP3s of me playing each phrase, as well as a band in a box file with all of them. So if you own the program, you can slow them down, loop them, or transpose them. Oh boy, I'm losing my voice. A MIDI file is also included, which you can do the same with using the free app MuseScore. And all of this is available for a nominal contribution from jazzguitar.richiezelland.com/premium, and you will find it under transcriptions. Let's examine the next couple of Joe Henderson phrases I adapted in my solo. And the first one is a repetition of one I showed you initially from Joe's solo on Invitation. And for some reason, this is Joe's solo that I adapted more ideas from in the solo I previously played. But trust me, I did not plan this. It's just what came to mind this time. The next one is adapted from a variation of a motif Henderson used over one note on his solo over 4 from his album with Wynton Kelly. And this is a variation of a line I've heard Coltrane play as well as many other saxophonists. Let's listen to the final portion of my solo and see if you can identify where I adapted these phrases. So how can you practice these concepts so you can use them in your solos? Well, the first factor you should keep in mind is that you can't recall them unless you can first hear them in your head. This is why we call it vocabulary. Just like any word we use in our spoken language, we hear in our head exactly how it's going to sound right before we pronounce it. Otherwise, we'll mess it up. In this case, we are using mainly 4-note motifs, which are not so hard to remember. The hard part, though, is their placement over a given piece of harmony. And this is harder, of course, if you're using rhythmic displacement. So let me tell you how I recall them. For rhythms, what I do is my own version of a system of vocal percussion used in Indian Carnatic music. And it is called Kanakal and consists of singing percussive syllables. So let me show you how I recall a couple of these displaced rhythms. Let's take the initial example in triplets where I first explained rhythmic displacement. It sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So in this case, the syllables I use to recall it are ta and ti. Ta denotes the beginning as well as lower note in the motif, while ti represents the other notes which are higher in pitch. So I would sing it in my head like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta ti ti ti, ta ti ti ti, ta ti ti ti. And here's how I think about it after playing maybe a regular bebop line in 16th notes. I actually use this concept to practice rhythms in my head when away from the instrument. Okay, here's an example for another one of the phrases I showed you earlier. 3, 4. Here I use the syllables tirutera. So on the beat it would sound like this. 3, 4. Tirutera, tirutera, tirutera. Displaced. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, tirutera, tirutera, tirutera. And last but not least, I have to warn you, some of these short motifs can look deceptively easy when playing out of context. However, when you sequence them and try to play them at certain tempos, you will find, especially if you're a guitarist like me, that some of them are physically impossible to execute beyond a medium tempo. So be sure to start practicing them slowly and pay special attention to make sure you are using precise timing. Do not practice them without using a metronome or a program like, say, Band in a Box. And that wraps it up for today. I hope this lesson has been to your liking and you have learned something new. As usual, I want to encourage you to comment, and your likes are much appreciated. And if you enjoyed this lesson and this is your first time on this channel, be sure to subscribe so you will be notified of my upcoming videos. Practice, 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 rinse and repeat, and may peace be with you.